Okay, so something that I've been doing recently is going through the creation story in Genesis 1 in order to understand how patterns of attention are made manifest in that creation story. And pretty early on the second day of creation, there's something pretty important that is laid out, which I think is a fundamental pattern, and I think it's very useful to understand what attention is. So I thought I would share the verses that are about the second day of creation, and then that I would share some thoughts that I have about that. So, starting on Genesis 6, it says, "Then God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the water, and let it divide the water from the water. And it was so. Thus God made the firmament, and God divided the water into the firmament from the water above the firmament. So God called the firmament heaven, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening and morning, the second day." Now, very early on in the story of creation, something that is articulated is that the earth was formless and void, and there was darkness over the face of the waters. And within that, there's kind of an idea that nothing was created, so there was no distinction between anything. There was just this formless chaos and this formless potential that couldn't be distinguished. And the first thing that allows for there to be distinction is when God says, "Let there be light," and then light shines in the darkness. And the first distinction that is possible is the distinction between light, which is a manifestation of God on one hand, and darkness, which is the lower principle, on the other. Now, once this distinction is made, which is something like a vertical distinction between light on the right-hand side and darkness on the left, and then another distinction is made, which is horizontal, where the firmament in the middle separates the waters below from the waters above. Now, there's an idea that the Pajot brothers, Jonathan and Mathieu, talk about quite a lot, which is that the world as we experience it is made up of two halves which combine to make the same whole. One half of that is heaven, it's the unseen world, and the other half of that is earth, which is the world that is seen and physical. Now, having a distinction between the two and understanding the role that both the unseen world as well as the seen world have in our interpretation of things, I think is very important to understand how we attend to things and the power that attention has in forming our experience of the world. So within that, I thought I would share an example from my own life in order to talk about the manner in which attending to things can change things completely. When I was in university, I decided to make my major piano performance. I had been a pianist for about 11 years of my life at the time, because I started playing piano when I was 7 years old, and I entered university when I was 18. And I had had some decent success with it in high school as well as throughout my life leading up to that point. And for a variety of reasons, I decided that I wanted to make piano performance my major, so that I could better my skills as a pianist, and hopefully so that I could achieve some kind of success in the world of classical music. it wasn't always the case when I was growing up, but classical music became something that was deeply important to me as I grew older, and I viewed it as my means of singing to God and sharing something that I believed to be deeply important with others in a way that would improve their lives. And granted, there was a fair amount of ambition in there. I wanted to be a great pianist, I wanted to be well known, but mixed up with that ambition, there was also, I think, a genuine desire to serve God and to serve other people. And I thought that playing classical music would be my means through which I could achieve that. Now, when I started that as my major, it became quickly apparent that all of the experience that I had before was not going to actually be adequate for the difficulty of the repertoire I was playing and the kinds of expectations that were being placed on me as one of the few piano majors in the school that I was attending. And I quickly found myself way over my head. And it was a difficult and turbulent time because I was being asked to do things that I didn't really have the means to accomplish. Most of my experience leading up to this point had been with things that I enjoyed playing for my own benefit, like music from video games and movies. And I really cut my teeth on playing for choirs or being a pickchord keyboardist in musical theater. And the way that I learned to learn music was really in primarily as an accompanist. There were some pieces that I played that were for solo piano that were quite difficult throughout the years, but that was never my main focus. And my primary interest when I was learning piano, where I had the most success, was in accompaniment. Now, that kind of accompanimental part of the texture is only a piece of the overall texture that's found in solo piano repertoire. And when I actually came to play that kind of extremely difficult solo piano repertoire, like Chopin etudes and some of the more difficult Beethoven sonatas and things like that, I found myself completely overwhelmed. Part of that was that I didn't have a method to help me to parse out the density of information in classical repertoire, because the amount of balancing of voices one must do, the amount of notes to sift through is much higher in a Chopin etude than it is in a kind of chunk choir accompaniment part. And without any real method, I was quite overwhelmed, but there was a second difficulty that I ran into, which I would like to expound upon more, and I think it's more relevant to the point that I'm trying to make, or trying to share in a way that's more understandable. And that is that no matter how much I played, there seemed to be, well, the sound that I wanted to produce seemed to escape me. I had extremely, well, not extremely, that's not the right word. I had very clear ideas of the emotional arc that I wanted to take with the pieces that I was playing, and no matter how I seemed to practice them, I couldn't really get the sound out that I wanted to, and it was bizarre because in my mind there was clarity for the emotional arc of things, but then in actuality when I played, I was not able to distinguish the sound that I was producing. if in my mind there was a clear image, when I played physically and when I tried to listen to myself, there was, it was like somebody had taken that image and mixed it all together so that it was just a blur. And I couldn't distinguish with what I was doing, whether or not it was moving in the direction that I wanted to take it or moving away from the direction that I wanted to take it. And it was frustrating for me because with some of these pieces I became obsessive about assigning emotional meaning to notes and following the arc of the emotions of the piece and where it was going and everything. And one piece in particular that was like this was Obermann's Vallée by Franz Liszt. And that piece is a particularly rich one emotionally. Liszt was reading a novel called Obermann by a French author named Etienne de Senancourt. And the novel is about a disaffected young man who's something of a recluse who goes to live in Switzerland. And while there, he has these extreme bouts of melancholy and this overall the lack of direction in his life and a kind of existential ennui that, well, it's kind of like the epitome of angst is what this guy was going through. And in all of that melancholy and all of that directionlessness, he finds solace in nature. And Liszt, when he was writing this piece, he was traveling through Switzerland at the time, and the piece became part of his volume of piano works called The Years of Pilgrimage, which were reflective of his time traveling through different countries in Europe. The first year of that is about him traveling through Switzerland versus the second year is through Italy. And there's a third year, I believe, as well, but I'm forgetting what the travels are in that year. In any case, the way that Liszt constructs Obermann's Valley, which is his musical setting of the novel, is rich emotionally, and it goes a lot of different places where it starts off in an E major and this deeply, sorry, not an E major, it starts off in E minor in this deeply lost and melancholic sort of lament. And that goes on, and it goes through heightened little bits of despair before coming back to the lament. And throughout that initial section, there's this kind of back and forth between this lamenting, but then also this questioning where the guy is clearly depressed, but he's also not depressed in a way that he's just wallowing in his own misery. It's a questioning kind of depression. And from that state of depression, it leads into the next section where it states a new theme, which is a transformation of the original theme in E minor that's in C major. And here there's a kind of hopefulness where he's maybe finally starting to find some kind of a respite in the nature that's around him. And that doesn't last, though, because it quickly goes into a immensely turbulent and dissonant section that is rife with despair. And once that all works itself out, eventually it returns to the second theme, but this time it's in E major, And from this place, it extends fully into this rapturous experience and this kind of exalted religious joy, which is something like the melancholic young man finding his answer in the beauty of the natural world. In some ways, it's connected to some of the philosophy of Emerson and others. But throughout this entire piece, there's really a rich emotional journey that happens through despair to questioning to hope to even deeper despair to a final kind of arrival point at finding a place of solace and finding a place of purpose in the natural world. And the piece ends in E major, which is the opposite of that kind of, what's the exact opposite key of E minor, which is where it started out. Now, when I was in university, I became obsessed with this, and I was going through my own kind of difficult life experience at the time, which is very common for young men who are entering university. And I related to the piece in quite a few different ways. And for every note within this piece, I had an emotional purpose. I had a deep understanding of the emotional message that I wanted to tell with it, where I wanted it to go. But even though I had this clarity in my mind, there was a lack of clarity whenever I tried to practice things. And it became very difficult because I could not tell my left hand from my right. I had an emotion that I wanted to convey, but I had no understanding of the physical means of how to produce that specific sound. Neither did I have the ability to tell whether or not I was actually going in the right direction. And this quickly led to a place of deep confusion and pain. Because I cared about classical music as much as I did, and because I viewed it as my means of doing something good in the world. My struggle with those difficulties continued for quite a while, and eventually I didn't feel like I was finding the answers for why I was going through those things, so it led me to transfer universities so I could try to find those answers and try to improve. And through a set of difficult experiences, which I won't relate here right at the moment, I eventually came to realize that the root cause of the issues that I was having was the hearing loss that I had my entire life. Now, of course, if this is your first time hearing this story, it would seem perfectly obvious, like, of course, the pianist with hearing loss, why would you think that anything else would be the issue if you couldn't hear yourself while you're practicing? But for me at the time, this was not something that was immediately apparent whatsoever. And the reason for that was because my entire life I had a certain set of hearing aids which amplified sounds to both sides. And because I had amplification to both sides, there was no major difficulty in terms of being able to understand people or being able to understand music. being able to hear the full range of the keyboard, all of those things. And throughout my young life, from the time that I was diagnosed when I was 4 years old until the time that I was 15, I struggled mightily with shame and disgust in regards to the hearing loss that I had been given for whatever reason. Or at least it seemed like no reason at the time. And when I was 15 years old, I had an experience which made me flip my life around in quite a few ways. And from that, I came to accept my hearing loss and move past it emotionally. It was not a full acceptance because there were some conditions to it. I viewed work as my means to make the suffering of my existence worthwhile, and I thought that if I just tried hard enough and if I just pushed hard enough, then I could redeem something that was somewhat unredeemable in me. But at the same time, I overcame any kind of social fear that I had for it, which I had in bucket loads when I was much younger. And I no longer considered it an issue that I had to wrestle with because I found the way that I could compensate for it. And I no longer really had any shame, emotionally or socially. At the same time that I came to terms with my hearing loss, I switched to a new set of hearing aids that only amplified to one ear, where in the past my hearing aids amplified both sides, but because my right ear was deficient in comparison to my left, we switched to a setup that only amplified to the left side, and instead of amplifying sound directly into the right ear, the right hearing aid would act as a radio receiver and send things entirely to the left. And functionally what that meant was that I was operating on one ear doing the work of two, while the other ear was hardly doing anything. Whereas when I was growing up, it was amplification into both sides. Because of the timing with that, when I switched to those new hearing aids, and because I had emotionally accepted my hearing loss at the same time, it wasn't clear to me at all that my hearing loss could actually be affecting my experience in the world, that it could actually be affecting my music making. And it wasn't until I transferred universities and I went through some great difficulty there that I finally realized, shit, my hearing loss actually affects my playing. And the reason for all the difficulties that I've been having with interpreting pieces like Obermann and like others was because my ears did not have the physical capacity to sort out sound in the way that they needed to. And because I had, like I said, already come to an emotional understanding at the time that I switched to a new system, it wasn't clear to me whatsoever. And then once that difficulty was actually revealed, what was murky and evasive beforehand became clarified as to what my difficulty was, but that didn't actually make it any easier. In fact, it made it more impossible because the true face of the demon that I was fighting was revealed, and it became apparent to me that no matter how much I practiced, no matter how much I worked, it wasn't something that I could escape. Um, there was something impossible about the situation that I was in, and I rather felt like Bilbo and the dwarves and the Hobbit when they escape the the goblins in the mountain, only to find themselves surrounded by enemies on all sides. And Tolkien named that chapter "Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire," and I think in the book he even talks about how that's the circumstance that that catchphrase comes from. But in my circumstances, very much out of the mountains and into the woods kind of impossibility. Now, at the time that I realized that, it became something of a curse for me, because there is no way for me to evade it, and there is no obvious means by which I could overcome it. There was ways that I could try to ameliorate things, and ways that I could put band-aids on the wounds in the way that I practiced, but in terms of actually overcoming the underlying issue, there was no clear way forward with that. Now, I lived in that state of knowing what the problem was and not having any means to overcome it for something like 4 years. And during those 4 years, it wasn't, even though it was clear that it was my hearing loss, it wasn't clear to me that it was it wasn't clear to me that the kinds of hearing aids that I had were at the issue. And I found out about my hearing being the difficulty in regards to my music making in 2019. And it wasn't until I met my wife 3 years later, both through her own observations as well as through some reading that I was doing at the time, that it became even apparent that I should try going back to my old system of hearing aids. And eventually, I was able to try new hearing aids on, and then that solved a lot of the issues. And that's quite a profound experience that I think I'll relate at another time, not now. But the reason why I bring all of this up is because during those periods of years when I was trying to be a great pianist, when I was trying to serve God through my music making, while I was in that black set of circumstances, and I did not know where things were going, things seemed rather hopeless and meaningless. And all of the pain that I was in, all of the emotional turmoil about having this desire to sing, but then lacking the physical means to do so, it was all meaningless at the time. And because I didn't know where it was going or what the purpose of it was, the experience was made all the darker for that. Now, at the same time, during that time, the darkness of that experience forced me to examine music in a way that I would not have otherwise. It forced me to consider things in a way that I know for a fact if I didn't have that difficulty to begin with, I never would have dug that deep. Because the only reason why I dug that deep in the first place was to answer the pain that I was suffering through at the time. And in that, I was able to come to a far deeper understanding of music, and I was able to produce methods of practicing that worked for me, that worked for my students, that could actually handle the kind of difficulty of the classical repertoire in a way that was systematic, which was lacking. When I met my wife, she helped me with the physical aspects of playing to have a deep understanding of the way that the body works and how to move the body at the piano. And when I got the new hearing aids, all of a sudden I could hear those things which had been eluding me the entire time in university and the few years beyond it. Now, when I saw that where that was going, when I saw the blessings that God gave me through that trial that I was allowed to endure, the meaning of those circumstances changed completely. Where instead of being a hopeless curse in an impossible situation and a cruel joke, it became one of the most meaningful things I would pass through. And it led me to a clearer vision of light than I would have seen had I not passed through that blackness first. That's all to say, in those events within my own life, it is not the circumstances themselves that the meaning arises from. It's the manner in which we tend to the circumstances of our lives that the meaning is given. Because what was once hopeless and nihilistic became deeply meaningful. And our capacity to attend is something like the ability to give meaning where meaning is lacking, to shine light in the darkness. And in the separation of the waters from the waters, we're reminded of an important principle, which is that there's a difference between the seen and the unseen realities of our lives and our lived experience. And the seen reality is, or the world that we live in, the physical tangibility of matter, as well as the explicit circumstances and events of our lives. But the unseen world is the way in which we attend to that lower matter, to those lower events. The unseen world is the meaning that we give to things around us. And it's in the way that we assign unseen meaning to tangible things that our actual experience of the world is created. And it's in that matter that a heaven can be made out of a hell, and a hell can be made out of heaven. So, as we attend to things, as we meet the world around us, it's important to remember that how we attend to the world is what shapes the world itself. And I think that's something like the meaning of the waters being separated from the waters.